Though they were heavily outnumbered, the combined Greek-speaking forces assembled at Thermopylae were confident of victory. They hoped the narrow passage along the coast would funnel the foreign army into their phalanx, and that Hellenic valor would win the day against their foes. Alas, it was not to be. Worse yet, the Greek-speaking army would not be able to claim that its sacrifice had slowed the foreign enemy, for the Romans were soon to fracture the might of the Seleucids and their Greek allies as the Republic marched inexorably towards the eventual annexation of Greece and Asia Minor. Wait, you probably weren't expecting the Romans to show up here at Thermopylae, were you? You were expecting the Persians. Well, the truth is that there was more than one battle at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, and for good reason. The small stretch of land between the mountains and the sea lay on a crucial route through ancient Greece, and commanders knew it was the perfect spot for a smaller force to stand its ground against a larger foe. But the problem for the Seleucids was that when you choose a battlefield as famous as Thermopylae, your opponents will be familiar with its Achilles heel, the small, passable paths through the mountains that allow elite shock troops to flank the defending army. This is what the forces of Xerxes had famously done in 480 BCE, and it was a tactic that the Romans, intimately familiar with Hellenic history and culture as they were, would also employ in 191 BCE, with a detachment led by Cato the Elder, circumventing the Seleucid lines and provoking panic that led to a rout. Viewed in retrospect, Antiochus's decision to face the Romans at Thermopylae looks like a huge mistake, given the Roman knowledge of this weakness, but the pass had actually been successfully held by an Athenian coalition in 323 BCE, and maybe he figured Greek luck would see him through. The Romans themselves actually successfully held the pass against an army of invading Goths hundreds of years later, circa 254 of the Common Era. So perhaps it was possible to find victory there. Multiple battles occurring at the same location was not altogether uncommon in antiquity, as before the development of modern logistics operations and the invention of aircraft or other reliable forms of motor transportation, armies typically followed set routes while on the march, meaning there were specific areas where the opposition knew they could be intercepted and forced into a confrontation. Thermopylae may be an extreme example, as history records 5 full-scale battles being fought there during antiquity. But whereas these battles were separated by a century or more, during the chaos of 69, known now as the Year of the Four Emperors, Italy itself would play host to 2 battles in more or less the same place within just 6 months, as the Roman world reeled from the shattered illusion of the Pax Romana. Rome would experience the first civil war in 100 years, and the first to be fought in the imperial era, with the absolute power of the princeps as the ultimate, tantalizing reward. For centuries, Rome had subjected the wider Mediterranean to the horrors of war, and now it was coming home. The 2 most important battles of the Civil War would be fought on Italian soil, outside the small town of Bedriacum in northern Italy, once part of the province of Cisalpine Gaul, but now recognized as fully Italian. The battles occurred here because the town was on the Italian side of the Alps, and held strategic value as the guardian of the important passes through the Apennine Mountains that connected the Po River Valley to Latium, which contained Rome. The confrontations had to happen here, lest the sitting emperors risk their opponents piercing into the vital Roman countryside and endangering the city itself. In April of 69, the forces of Emperor Otho, including the Praetorian Guards he had bribed to assassinate Galba, the previous emperor, were defeated by the Rhine legions commanded by Vitellius, the governor of Germania Inferior. The Rhine soldiers who had risen against Otho may have claimed that they sought to punish Otho for his betrayal of Galba, but everyone knew the truth. They only fought to secure the position of their general, so that he could reward them from the imperial treasury. 40,000 Romans perished on this day, simply to satisfy the egos of Vitellius and Otho, and for the greed of soldiers who sought ever more riches from the state. In October, just 6 months later, the troops loyal to Vespasian, under the command of his subordinate Marcus Antonius Primus, encountered Vitellius's army outside Bedriacum, and the stage was set for another confrontation in the same general vicinity. Posted in the far east and dealing with the Jewish revolt at the outbreak of the Civil War, Vespasian was the final warlord to press his claim to the throne, and his soldiers arrived to find Italy in upheaval under the mismanagement of Vitellius, a man whose cruelty was surpassed only by his gluttony. Though there is little reason to believe he was a man of high character, Vitellius comes across so poorly in our sources that we can sense the presence of political propaganda from the Flavian dynasty, directed at the man to make it seem that Vespasian had no choice but to march on Rome and depose Vitellius. The disciplined, veteran legions of Vespasian would win the day, defeating Vitellius's forces. Antonius then rewarded his legions by allowing them to sack the nearby city of Cremona. Over a nightmarish 4-day period, the victorious soldiers treated the Roman city, with its Roman citizen inhabitants, with all the cruelty and abuse they were used to inflicting upon foreigners. Told that they would not be permitted to keep the Cremonans as slaves, the soldiers simply murdered their captives. After pillaging the city, Antonius commanded Vespasian's forces to march on Rome, where Vitellius was apprehended and unceremoniously given a brutal public execution. In the madness, the Temple of Jupiter, chief god of the Romans, and the most magnificent religious building in the city, was torched. A pious Roman could be forgiven for believing their gods had abandoned them. This descent into anarchy and bloodshed would be expertly chronicled by the historian Tacitus, who came to view the conflict as the most horrific tragedy Rome had yet experienced, as it pitted Roman against Roman, and confirmed that the republican ideals he so cherished were officially dead, buried beneath the ambition of a select few men for absolute power, and torched by the soldiers who placed the wealth promised by their commanders ahead of any patriotism, civic loyalty, or religious duty to Rome. Reading his Histories, one comes away with the vision of Tacitus as a shattered idealist, singing a funeral dirge to a Rome that appears lost forever. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. The Republic was of course no stranger to civil wars, but each of the conflicts that had weakened the Republican consensus and paved the way for the imperial state could at least be traced back to fundamental questions over how the political and economic life of the Republic was to be ordered. The jockeying between Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, however, was simply about which man would sit the throne, and therefore which specific legions were to become wealthy due to his largesse. The battles at Bedriacum were the logical conclusion of an imperial military monarchy without clear succession laws, and Tacitus bemoans how the selfish ambition of these claimants plunged the Roman world into war, where Roman fought Roman, and most shockingly of all, where a son may even fight against his father. An event which made the slaughter more dreadful was the death of a father at the hands of his son. I record the incident and the names on the authority of Vipsantius Messala, a recruit to the Hurricane Legion. One, Julius Mansuetus from Spain, had left a young lad at home. Soon after, the boy came to age, and having been called up by Galba for service in the 7th, chanced to encounter his father in the battle, and wounded him seriously. As he was searching the prostrate and semi-conscious figure, father and son recognized each other. Embracing the dying man, the son prayed in words choked by sobs that his father's spirit would be appeased and not bear him ill will as a parricide. The act was not a personal one, and one single soldier was merely an infinitesimal fraction of the forces engaged in the civil war. With these words, he took up the body, dug a grave, and discharged the last duty to his father. Some nearby troops noticed this, then more and more, and so throughout the lines ran a current of wonder and complaint, and men cursed the cruelest of all wars. However, this did not stop them killing and robbing relatives, kinsmen, and brothers. they said to each other that a crime had been done, and in the same breath did it themselves. The image of a son killing his father is horrifying and brings home a human perspective to this tragedy. But as shocking as we find this incident, the Romans would have been even more appalled, for the slaying of a father by his own offspring was the single most unspeakable crime they could conceive of, and as such it merited the penalty of the sack, perhaps the most horrific form of execution the Romans employed. Patricide was more than just a murder. It was an inversion of the natural order of their patriarchal society, and as such, an affront to all that they held dear. An earlier video recounts Cicero's defense of a man accused of patricide, and that the scandal associated with the case was so great that many lawyers were too afraid to even be associated with a man merely accused of this great crime. To Tacitus, the death of Julius Mansuetus was symbolic of the death of the natural republican order, and imperial Rome severing its bonds to what had originally made it so great. It's a powerful symbol, and one that still resonates 2,000 years later. But there is a danger that reducing Julius Mansuetus to a mere symbol, even one that is so evocative, may erase his status as a real flesh and blood human that was no different from you or I. He was struck down in a pointless battle by his own son, someone that he had likely spent years training in the ways of war, as Roman fathers often did for their sons. If we can go beyond the text for a moment, it's not hard to imagine that one day as a young boy, his son felt a rush of joy as he bested his father in a mock duel, and that Julius himself likely felt a flash of fatherly pride as he thought about the brave, strong, and proper Roman man that he was raising. These moments of elation must have turned into torment for the surviving son, as he felt the very real sting of guilt for slaying his father, which, even in self-defense, and even in a war, was still a horror few could comprehend. The glory of battles and conquests fade rapidly, much more so than the scars they leave behind. The pain of loss was something that thousands of Roman families must have had to confront as Vespasian mounted the throne. He may have been crowned emperor and been honored as the new father of his country, but families across the Roman world would have had to deal with the emotional agony and economic uncertainty that resulted from the loss of thousands of fathers, sons, and brothers. Vespasian had won the civil war, but the Romans had lost. These ideas of the war as an avoidable tragedy are all present in Tacitus's account. His heavy moralizing has caused some to question his objectivity, but we must recall that Tacitus actually lived through the events he describes. He was not a dispassionate scholar dwelling in an ivory tower, but a man who had borne witness to what he viewed as an unspeakable horror, and wanted to make its causes apparent to his readers so that it hopefully would never be repeated. Personally, I'm glad that Tacitus isn't neutral in his assessments. I don't know that there would be much value in a historical work chronicling the mass bloodshed that tore the Roman world apart if the author wasn't horrified by the events he described, or intent on using his work to try to prevent such a conflict from erupting in the future. Tacitus knew that the dead would never return, but that by presenting an unvarnished account of the events that led to their deaths, we pay them the only honor that we still can, by making their suffering count in some small measure towards the eradication of the oppression, greed, and destructive ambition that laid waste to so many lives. It is work that is ambitious, and frankly necessary, for Tacitus's refreshing humanity offers a tether to the ancient world, where we can see firsthand how the realities of imperial power politics disrupted countless lives, and how emperors brought about suffering for their own aggrandizement. It's also work that remains incomplete. War and oppression unfortunately remain with us. But for as long as we endure this stain, we must work to keep the focus not on the conquerors who are the authors of so much misery, but on those who suffer under them. History belongs to them as well.